going on,
What
podcast world?
So, welcome to the first ever Inquirious podcast. My name is the inaugural.
Yes.
My name is Maximilian Sejo. I go by Max, and I'm here with my co-host, Justin Bailey.
Yes, that is my name. It's exciting to be here. I mean, this is just totally outside of what I thought we'd end up doing at some point. It started very different, but here we are trying to basically have normal conversations that we have on a daily basis with microphones.
You got to change with the times, my friend.
You got to change with the times. Here we are.
So, because this is the first podcast, the first Inquirious podcast, I figured we'd start by introducing ourselves.
That's smart.
So, yeah, it's probably smart.
Yeah.
Because they don't really know us
We
yet.
planned this out.
Yeah, we did actually.
Yeah.
Surprising.
Yeah.
So I am a student and professional. I focus my studies on economics here in sunny Florida. And Justin.
Well, I am also I guess you could say, student and professional, and my studies are focused on philosophy and religion. So it's a bit of an interesting exchange that we have in the studies that we do, because they do interact with each other totally, like most liberal arts subjects.
Yeah.
They all kind of interact with each other at some point. But yeah, philosophy definitely cuts at the heart, and economics is cutting at the heart of another world.
There you go, the heart of another.
Yes, it sounds really mean.
It does,
We're cutting.
We're cutting hearts.
Yeah.
All right,
Wow.
well,
It's
why are we
morbid.
cutting hearts, Justin? Why do we need to cut these hearts?
Right. So, I mean, I guess that leads us into why this is even happening. And the short version of that story is Max and I just found ourselves at one point walking the streets of New York.
Chance of fate.
Yeah, yes, apparently. Chance of fate. That's a very interesting
Yeah, we
way
could
of
talk
putting
about
it.
that in
That's another podcast.
episode.
Found ourselves both equally frustrated with the difficulty of having kind of rational conversations about topics that are really heated, foundational issues, things that deal with political policy or religious views or philosophical notions and ethical notions. These things that around the water cooler, it seems to get really heated because people have their deep views, but lots of times they don't really know how to articulate them. And so in the defense of those views, it tends to get sour. And so we wanted to kind of, we found ourselves being able to have these conversations for whatever reason, even though we share some fundamental differences in certain views, but we found ourselves able to have a conversation. And because of that fact, we kind of wanted to explore what were the causes. Why can we talk about this sort of thing, and some people couldn't? So we talked about it for a while. And after we got done from the trip that we were on, we decided to start a blog. So tell them about the blog that we started up.
So yeah, we did about 4 kind of more long-form based discussion blogs where we unpacked particular issues. We did one on abortion.
We formatted it.
Yeah.
We basically said, okay, one of us asks a question, then the next person replies.
Yeah, it was really structured. It was like there was a maximum of 5 entries.
Right.
3 from the person who initiated it. We tried to put ourselves in in parameters that would allow us to unpack an issue in like 2,000 to 3,000 words.
Right.
But that would, that could maybe resonate with people.
Sure.
But there was one problem. People don't read.
It's true. It did not resonate.
Yeah, it did not resonate. And, whether that's a fault of us remains to be seen.
Probably.
I
mean, I would assume.
That's true.
I mean, it's so hard to get a voice out there. There's you go on Facebook or Twitter, there are literally millions of voices at one time throwing articles constantly. Read this. And so it's hard to break through, especially when some of your articles are 15, 20 minutes long on topics that people sometimes are afraid to even go through the weeds.
Yeah, we're inhibited by the lack of a barrier to entry, which is great for a lot of things, but when you're really trying to get stuff out there,
right.
There's something to be said for a barrier to entry.
It's hard, for sure. But anyway, so doing that blog, though, was really helpful for both of us. I mean, we took a lot away from each one that we did, and it just became impractical for us to continue doing it because there was a lot of prep time, to doing the research, just like we've done some research for this. But it would be kind of a week or 2 week process to go from response to response to response to response with the research between each response kind of going back and forth. So we figured, it just became kludgy. I moved away. He was around here still, and so we kind of put a brief hiatus onto that, which leads us into a few nights ago, basically.
Right. We finished a long discussion about some topic with tremendous weight, as we tend to do.
It was like 10 topics.
It was
Just
10
weaved
topics
into
with all tremendous weights. We cut at the hearts of all of them.
just cutting.
Just straight cutting.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And we had the idea that we should start a podcast because, well, there's a lot of podcasts and everybody's doing it. And for some reason, we have the gall to believe that you guys want to listen to our podcast.
Which is questionable.
It is absolutely questionable.
But, I mean, how do you know until you start doing it?
Exactly.
And then they get to this point and they're like, wow, I got to turn this off.
Right, exactly.
But maybe not.
Maybe not.
You know, who
maybe
knows?
there's still like one of you out there that's
Right.
listening, like the one devoted follower.
And this is for you.
This is for you. That's what we're going to take away
Yeah,
from this.
that's the
This
big
is for
takeaway.
you. All right. So with that, what are we talking about? What are we giving that person?
Right. So, you know, each time, obviously, we're gonna pick a topic and kind of go at it and see where it goes. And this time, what seemed ironically relevant, not just because it's recently happened, but for the basic idea of what we're trying to do here is just have nice civil discourse about things we may disagree about. We may agree sometimes, whichever it is. But being able to
would agree at least once or twice.
Once or twice, here or there. No, we'll probably find substantive agreement in
that's true.
tons of things.
Yeah.
But that being said, there was a recent dialogue over email between the neuroscientist and philosopher Sam Harris, who's basically got a huge name for himself recently in the past 10 years after 9/11.
Thanks to Ben Affleck, really, in the
Well,
last
recently,
couple of months.
Calling him a racist, I believe. Was that the
Yeah, it was
direct
the term, a racist, yeah.
Yeah. He was pretty Batman angry about it, too.
Yeah, I mean, you know, he's one of those people that doesn't like that term. He doesn't like being pigeonholed into that area. So.
No, yeah. What is it in the preview? The Batman preview, is it, do you bleed? I feel like he was at that point of anger.
Yeah.
If he had the suit on,
well, yeah,
he was right there.
I could see him, you know, in that kind of vein, you know,
Yeah.
next to Ben Affleck.
He really put on the muscle, huh? Okay, so back to the subject at hand. So Sam Harris has definitely made a name for himself. Post 9/11, he wrote a book called The End of Faith. He's extremely secular soul. And another guy who has made massive contributions to linguistics, to philosophy, to foreign policy, critiques, a guy by the name of Noam Chomsky. So that's going to be kind of the way that we frame and discuss, is just basically going through their little email interchange, which you'll discover didn't go as well as, let's say, Mr. Harris had hoped.
Yeah, well, I'd say that.
And before we get into that, I just want to read a couple of things that I thought were funny while I was doing some research. These are some headlines, and we talk about headlines sometimes between me and Max because we have our own individual blogs and we talk about the different elements of headlines. Here were some headlines post Harris posting this blog.
I haven't heard this yet, so this is going to be as interesting for me as it will be for you.
So you can tell me which ones really strike a chord for you, and hopefully, you know. So here's one. Sam Harris made himself look like an idiot in an email exchange with Chomsky and has shared it with the world.
Seems pretty unbiased.
I think so. Here's another one. Sam Harris exposes Noam Chomsky as a pedantic contrarian, unwilling to debate seriously.
I wonder what he thinks about that.
Yeah. These aren't clickbait.
No.
Sort of headlines. No. Noam Chomsky versus Sam Harris. Rationale versus hate.
Ah, there you go. No, but which is which?
Yes. Sam Harris begs Noam Chomsky to publicly embarrass him. I like that one. I know that was an interesting one.
There's something in that.
Notion.
It's a little it's a little beautiful.
I appreciated that. Professional atheist. I didn't know that was a profession.
Man, I gotta get on that gig.
I know.
Like, do they pay you?
I mean, he technically gets paid for his book.
Sure, but there's got to be like a foundation, right? That like pays you.
I guess. Yeah.
I'm into that. Let's go.
Maybe that's some sort of we could discuss that maybe as some sort of government program.
There you go.
Professional, whatever you believe.
You know what we're gonna do? Right? We're gonna tax religion to fund it. That's gonna be great.
Perfect.
Come on.
He will be totally for this.
He will be totally for it.
So professional atheist Sam Harris looks like an idiot in his email exchange with Noam Chomsky. So I just like that one because professional atheist sounds fun.
Yeah.
So that being said, let's get into our discussion.
All right.
Okay, so before we get started actually discussing the content of their exchange, I wanted to play for you, Max, a little clip from Harris's post-conversation, quote-unquote, podcast that he left. And it kind of reveals, I think, quickly, it reveals what Harris was intending to do. So here it is.
Apart from violence and other forms of coercion, all we have is conversation with which to influence one another. And the fact that it's so difficult for people to have civil and productive discussions about things like U.S. foreign policy or racial inequality or religious tolerance and free speech, this is profoundly disorienting. And it's also dangerous. If we fail to do this, we will fail to get everything else of value.
So what's your initial response to that notion?
Well, I mean, I think that idea is it's important now. You know, there's probably a critique laying in there if you read the actual email exchange, which
we'll get to.
Yeah, it'll be in
the
the show notes as well if you want to click on it and read it now.
Right.
That it strikes me that he says that, right, and he believes absolutely that he thinks that.
Right.
Though I don't think he
doesn't know how to execute it.
Yeah, he didn't do that.
Right. So I think we don't want to, when we're critiquing some of these things, I don't necessarily think, I mean, it's helpful to know what he wants to do.
Sure.
Right? And that kind of, to some degree, is part of what we're going to be talking about. The execution of that, obviously. So a couple of things that I wrote down just in reading his initial opening email to Chomsky, which was basically just, hey, let's talk about this. But in the process of it, he did a couple things that, for me, if I was trying to engage somebody who I was quite positive disagreed with me, I mean, there's videos online, it's clearly ideological differences, all sorts of stuff like that. You know this individual disagrees, and you're from minute one. Because Harris starts talking with this tone in his writing, which this tone is pretty consistent in Harris's writing. I mean, it's kind of how he writes. So as the receiver of this email, maybe it would be partly your responsibility to go like, oh, that's Sam. Like, that's how he writes. He cuts you. Like, we're back to cutting.
He cuts at your heart.
Yeah,
that's
he cuts
the theme.
at your. That's cutting. The theme. Yeah, he cuts at you. But a couple of things that I noticed in that first one, he basically. He wants to have this conversation, which that clip communicates, that he wants to do this. But then he kind of immediately segues into using somewhat of a divisive tone or language towards Chomsky by kind of talking about how he, well, you've called me a quote-unquote religious fanatic, or you've called me that you said that I quote-unquote worship the religion of the state.
It's certainly not what you want to use to break the ice.
Yeah, it's not an icebreaker. Maybe like... Professor Chomsky, I really respect your contributions to, academia, to all the different fields. It's vast. I know we have our disagreements, but I respect the contributions that you've made, and I want to have a conversation about our disagreements because I just want to explore them. Maybe that wouldn't have gone. I mean, there's something to say about the ivory tower. People maybe want to say that somehow there's massive psychological differences. I mean, if somebody's kind of an ass, which Sam Harris comes off as being an ass,
yeah.
Chomsky is not another species. He's a human being. He reacts
allegedly.
Yeah. He reacts just like you or I probably would to somebody who comes off like that, right? I mean,
when I read that first sentence, I was like, well, I mean, so for lack of a better term, well, he's an ass. All right, he's an asshole. Okay, but now let's actually get into the weeds.
But the unfortunate thing is that when you're like that, it kind of takes away from the point that you're going to try to make. It doesn't necessarily take away from it in a substance, logical type way, but it takes away from it in an emotional, rhetorical sense, which we're engaging in this sort of way. So it's extremely important because you can't just discount it as being an aspect of the conversation.
Right. Yeah, we tend to, as humans, when we hear, especially in a world when you're Noam Chomsky, imagine how much he hears on a daily basis from people criticizing him. Right. I mean, it's been he outlines it in his emails since through the 80s, through the 90s, after 9/11, consistently, and he just ignores it. So I'm sure
he's already on a bit of a short fuse.
Right, he's on a short fuse, and I'm sure when he read the first paragraph
already thinking certain things about Sam Harris.
Yeah, of Sam Harris's email, he was just like, oh God, not again.
Right. Like here's another wannabe intellectual troll who's not looked at what I've said, who's not honestly engaged. And though that may or may not be the case in Harris's case, Harris makes the point clear almost in his negative kind of asshole tone.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate because it really could have been what Harris maybe wanted it to be, but he starts. So the point that comes to mind as soon as I start reading that initial email is start well.
Right.
You know what I mean?
That's a tip for everyone. On anything you do, start well.
Right. I mean, it seems like a common sense point.
Yeah.
But it goes totally, and I'm not one to say that I always do this, because I definitely have a problem. And anybody who knows me, who's listening to this podcast, is probably like chuckling, going, well, he's kind of like that too.
He's has to.
And to be fair to Harris, I've listened to him, and where he admits that that's a problem of his, and that he doesn't want to be, that's not what he wants to be known as forever. And I don't either. So, but when you know that that's what's happening, and you're sitting and you have the opportunity to write an email to somebody to get started on a conversation that you want to have with them, it just doesn't seem like Harris started out well.
Yeah, and we totally agree on that. So let's move to something that we don't agree on, or that there maybe is some more contention, so that we keep our one listener.
That's true. We want to do that. So another thing, did you get the sense from Harris that he was denying moral atrocities, like U.S. moral atrocities?
So that's an interesting question, because I don't think he was denying moral atrocities, but I will say as a qualifier, his game, you could say, that he was playing with Chomsky, in a sense, I'm sure he wouldn't describe it as a game, but
he may.
Maybe he would.
He's kind of a game theorist sort of guy.
Yeah. Well, then rest in peace, John Nass. He would then. He was kind of goading Chomsky on a little bit by maybe ignoring something here and ignoring something there, and trying to do this very much philosophical, type of game in which he's focusing in on this point about intention and moral intention. And Chomsky's like, wait a minute, these people died, and you're talking about intention. Now, not to say that I don't necessarily disagree with some of the things Harris said, but I think the way he approached Chomsky in that sense was kind of just a little bit, again, Sam Harris-y. Right,
yeah. It did seem that way. Now, not to, and I don't want to come off as a Harris apologist, because in typical contexts, me and him would probably find massive disagreements, and I would want to have a conversation with him about a number of things. But I see what you're saying. I mean, in the sense of that, what he didn't do because he basically explicitly talks about all sorts of things that the U.S. has done that he doesn't approve of: genocidal treatment of the Native Americans. He goes into 100 years of slavery, denial of Jewish refugees during the Third Reich. He explicitly lists a bunch of things, and he doesn't say this is it.
Right.
And he doesn't also say that things that have happened in the last 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, whatever it is, have been in some sort of moral realm above that either. He doesn't seem to be saying that, but I see your point totally in the sense that he's not, maybe he's choosing to do this, or maybe he's not choosing to do this, of knowing that this is going to aggravate Chomsky.
Right.
That he's not granting the fact that certain things ended up having at least really bad consequences.
Mm-hmm. And I think for a conversation like that, specifically between Noam Chomsky and Sam Harris, there has to be an initial point in which Sam Harris, in this case, as the one who initiated the conversation, would say, I understand what you're saying, right? And that these things happened, they were very, very bad.
Right.
And that, in this case, they were talking about a bombing in Sudan that Bill Clinton did. Bill Clinton should be held culpable for it as gross negligence, and then move on to that. I think that might not to say that that necessarily should always be a quantifier, but in this case with Chomsky, it might have helped.
Yeah, and it may be the case that Harris would agree with that sort of diagnosis of where Clinton's responsibility fits in the spectrum. But it seems like that's what he was trying to get at the entire time, was the spectrum.
Right.
And Chomsky didn't want to really talk about the spectrum. Chomsky seemed to be kind of avoiding the spectrum conversation and was making it a little bit too white and black for the situation, I think. In the context, and this is where we had a little bit of conversation. They were having two separate conversations, it seemed like.
Yeah. One was talking about ethics, and one was talking about foreign policy and essentially death of humans that occurred in history. I think, so Chomsky, without, I don't want to have to psychoanalyze Chomsky's whole career, because I am neither in any place to do that, because I don't even know enough about Noam Chomsky. I only know contemporarily what he's been, his influence on the media, not his academic works. I think it can be valuable for a political thinker, like someone like Noam Chomsky, to, as you said, make things a little bit more black and white, in the sense of, you have to have a thesis about what occurred in foreign policy, and something is bad and some things are good in a lot of sense. But mainly when you're critiquing foreign policy, you're saying it's bad. And I think that's a problem inherent in foreign policy, in the sense that, what is good foreign policy?
Right.
What is that?
Well, and that's where I think Harris is trying to get at the point of having that conversation. But before you can get to that conversation, you have to sort of diagnose how it is you're going to even think about these ethical questions. I mean, so a bombing of a Sudanese, pharmaceutical facility, you would need to know not only the variables of why or why not you are going to do this from a factual standpoint of what's the evidence of what's going on here, but then you would need to, if you're going to look back on it and in retrospect talk about culpability. There's culpability in a legal sense, and then there's culpability in an ethical sense. Obviously, the ethical hopefully is informing the legality of things, but then as we're thinking about the ethical side of it, that's when I feel like Harris is constantly trying to get Chomsky to go with him down that road, and Chomsky doesn't want to go down that road.
Yeah.
For whatever reason. Maybe there's a good reason he doesn't want to go down that road.
There's only one moment when he puts his foot on the road, which is when he talks about he throws Harris's moral intention argument back into his face and talks about, if moral intention actually played such a role in good and bad, or good or evil, then wouldn't Hitler or Stalin in Russia, there's innumerable examples that you could use, seeing themselves as morally pure.
Now, do you find it, where do you place intentions when you talk about moral? So if I'm driving down the road, right, and I, there's a baby in a baby carriage crossing the street 100 yards in front of me, and I decide in my head that I'm going to run that child down, or I'm driving down the road and I'm being an idiot and I'm texting, and that same carriage runs across. Am I the same person? Is that the same? At the end of the day, the baby's dead, right? So are you labeling me in the same way?
So I think, obviously there's a clear difference between those two, and that's how the legal system would approach those two.
Right. Do you think fairly?
The legal system approaching anything fairly as it is now, but in an abstract sense, I think, yes, we should give more leeway to people who make a mistake than who purposefully, commit a crime.
Now, why?
I think this is part of the part that I really agree with Harris on, is that intention tells you about future actions. In a broad sense. Obviously, there's going to be some exceptions.
So that's the utility of it. I suppose, right, from a societal perspective, of looking at intentions. But from an ethical perspective, right, something different happened in the little random case that I just made up. Something very different happened, and it tells you not just about what that person may do in the future, but it also kind of tells you something about who the person is, right? I mean, would you agree?
Yes.
Right. So then how does that, so thinking about that in that sense, how does that then apply when you would want to kind of downshift back out of moral intention being an important aspect of how, an extremely important aspect of how we look at these sorts of foreign policy issues that end up happening? I mean, obviously the body counts, like it just in that case, the body counts the same,
Mm-hmm.
right? But they're different things are happening. So how do we look at those things?
So this is how I approach the issue. When you have someone, which is this in these, you talk about Al-Qaeda, or that's essentially what Harris talks about all the time,
Right.
Or Islamic extremism, as maybe he'd like to say. You're looking at a group that is, with intention, committing crimes for the sake of committing those crimes and for the result of those crimes.
Right.
So now I think just to come down quickly between them, is there a moral equivalence between what happened in Sudan and what Al-Qaeda does? No. What happened in Sudan is, from a moral perspective, less immoral. Now, when...
Now Chomsky really questioned, he would really push back on you there.
Yes.
And he pushes back in this exchange because that's basically the point that Harris is trying to make. I mean, he may be not doing it to the best of his ability, but he's trying to make that point, basically. He's trying to say, Professor Chomsky, can you at least grant to me just this basic notion that if that was the way that it was, that the situation in Sudan is different than, like you gave the example of some purposeful Al-Qaeda bombing,
right,
or something like that. So would you say that you just kind of separate from Chomsky in viewing things that way?
I would separate in this exchange from Chomsky, but once you move past that, I think it gets a little bit cloudier in the sense that, all right, when we look at, okay, let's say America, right? The capabilities of America to, let's say America was in the hands of Al-Qaeda, right?
Right.
The capability that Al-Qaeda at that point would have to commit atrocities across the world would be outstandingly greater than they're currently capable of doing.
Sure.
So, with that capability,
which Harris brings up this perfect example we could talk about how he does this.
Sure.
The perfect
elaborate.
weapon. Well, the perfect weapon example, right? He gives, and I think that, I mean, do you think that was helpful or no?
The perfect weapon. I think to unlock the pure...
For our listeners, do we want to just explain what
let's
the perfect
explain
weapon
that
is?
to them.
Yeah, let me find that real quick. So Harris brings up in one of the emails, I can't remember which exchange it was. There's a couple in. Chomsky's pressing him on answering a question. So he brings up a hypothetical. Harris he's got, I believe, a bachelor's degree in philosophy. He writes as a philosopher. This is what he does. He philosophizes. And part of what philosophers do, just like a scientist would use an experiment to try to test a hypothesis, ethicists and philosophers use thought experiments, right? So Chomsky doesn't seem to like this move, but it's important when we're talking about this if we're going to try to come on some solid ground before we move forward. So his idea, this is how Harris defines the perfect weapon analogy. So the weapon that would allow us either to temporarily impair or to kill a particular person or group at any distance without harming others or their property. So he says, say this exists. Say this perfect weapon exists. And you give it to the likes of a Bill Clinton or a George Bush. And you also give it to the likes of an Al-Qaeda or an ISIS. Are you saying that both would do morally equivalent things with that? So say there was a conflict. Would Bush and a Clinton do the same things with that perfect weapon? Would they indiscriminately kill innocent people? Would both do that? Would one side do that? I mean, how do you see that situation?
I think that is emblematic of why I have to say that, Al-Qaeda would be, more immoral than a Bill Clinton or a George W. Bush in that situation.
Because you would think...
I would think that Al-Qaeda would now, maybe they wouldn't have to kill civilians. Right? That's another aspect you could think about.
You would say that
as
they
well.
would be more likely to kill someone like me and you
Yes.
in the situation, as opposed to mine and yours
being
being there,
filming,
doing
a podcast,
doing a podcast in Iran or in Iraq or
right.
somewhere. So you would say that,
so I would say that. Now, sometimes the way that this is why sometimes I have this little issue with philosophy in a sense is that.
Go for it.
Yeah, I'm gonna unload on you.
We're
right
cutting.
Now. Yeah,
oh, geez.
Yeah, sorry.
Keep going.
The way that philosophy looks at an issue like this. Now, when you're looking at it on a plane of which it's a pure abstract philosophical question,
right?
The answer is clear. In the sense that
not really. I mean, philosophers disagree about almost everything.
In this instance, I would
right.
say for me the answer is clear.
Right.
Though. Then you have to get to the question of why would Al-Qaeda want to do what it does, which I'm not sure that we're going to go into completely in this obviously in this podcast, but the kind of point that I wanted to get to is this. So once you go past Chomsky's their morally equivalent stage, you move into a stage in which these discrepancies in capabilities really show themselves. So Al-Qaeda on its best day was able to kill as many as they killed in 9/11, right? Mm-hmm. So obviously in the couple of thousands of people, right? A horrible, heinous act.
Right.
America on its worst day could literally blow up the entire world. So when you're looking at those two things, the level of responsibility that needs to be placed.
Now, is the responsibility just because they have more weapons, or is it because that, like as Harris tries to point out, I was going to ask you this question because I wondered how you would take it. He makes the point that we, maybe quote unquote the West, are more how did he put it, morally wealthy. Right. That's how he puts
wealth.
it. Yeah, something about wealth, like material wealth. He views this as an objective thing that we can look at. So again, morality for Harris, and this is all based on objective notions of what's actually the good and what is actually the evil. So granting that exists, Harris would then say, well, we have more of it. We've got more of the truths we've got more of the moral truths. We've got it more worked out. We've got it more flushed out. Do you think that, so instead of the fact when you're making this proportional argument, kind of we have a lot of technology and they don't, so there's more responsibility on us because we have a lot of technology to do X or Y, whatever that thing is, as opposed to we have more quote unquote moral wealth than they do, and because of that moral wealth difference or disparity, then there's more responsibility or culpability on our end because of that.
Sure. Now, I would say, to answer that question, I think we have more moral wealth than Al-Qaeda, right? But I don't necessarily like the way he generalizes cultural, cultural leanings to the most extreme of those cultural leanings, right? So he talks about Afghanistan, or he talks about Iraq. I think there's one point, and he talks about in which they have their halftime performance in which they stone the adulterers, right?
Right.
This is obviously something that is what we view would be an immoral act. But to look at that, and he also then talks about America 200 years ago, to say then that they're just 150 years behind is one thing, right? But then to apply that to apply that like Afghanistan,
right?
Which is what
or
he would be
like
referencing
certain Indonesian
or
sort of
certain aspects of it. To apply that to the entire area of people who are quote unquote 150 years behind us,
right?
Is, I think, it's too broad, and it smooths over a bunch of different complexities in which, I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know if Sam Harris has been and traveled throughout the world. I know that I haven't nearly traveled enough throughout the world to make any, to know if they're happier, to know what...
He bases a lot of his points on statistical, like Pew Research statistics, and what do, what do... So he basically builds his case on what do the vast, or the vast numbers, let's say, of Muslims think about the Quran. What do they think about this belief? What do they think about that belief? And then he tries to use that and trails that into saying there's this number of people that thinks this about, let's say, the Quran.
Right.
The Quran teaches X, therefore it's safe to say that this sort of idea, and so then he'll say that this idea, the moral teaching found in this book here is wrong, therefore they are less morally wealthy. And that being said, I guess that's
Right.
where we're
And
talking
now-
about the philosophizing of morals.
Exactly.
And,
I think you can look at that and look at it and say logically that would make sense.
Mm-hmm.
But unless you would actually go there and talk to those people and live with those people,
Right.
how, sometimes, with all the great things that statistical analysis can give us, sometimes it fails to capture the innate humanity.
Hey.
Yeah, I know. I'm bashing statistics. Economics
I
guy
say
over
this
here.
to him sometimes, and I like it. I like it.
Yeah. So it sometimes fails to capture that innate humanity.
Yeah, I agree.
Particularly in the sense of what someone would do to another person who's standing right there in
Totally
front
agree.
of them.
I
They might give a different answer.
I totally agree with you. That actually is a perfect segue into a couple points that I wanted to make about Harris. There was a couple points in there. Let me read a quote that I thought was highly. It was very unnuanced.
Okay.
I mean, there was lots of those, obviously. But,
Yeah.
So, quote: if the situation had been reversed, which he's talking about situations of somebody has the power to do something. So if the situation had been reversed, what are the chances that the Iraqi Republican Guard, attempting to execute a regime change on the Potomac, would have taken the same degree of care to minimize civilian casualties? What are the chances that Iraqi forces would have been deterred by our use of human shields? What are the chances we would have even used human shields? What are the chances that a routed American government would have called for its citizens to volunteer to be suicide bombers? What are the chances that Iraqi soldiers would have wept upon killing a carload of American civilians at a checkpoint unnecessarily? You should have, in a ledger of your imagination, a mounting column of zeros. Now, I see what he's trying to do and what he's trying to say, but it is that point definitely I saw as a massive overgeneralization for the exact point that you made. It's one thing in an abstract sense, based on logical connectives, to say they would be, and I think you could run a probability, let's say,
Sure.
that based on probability, this logical string of beliefs would lead you into being more okay with that maybe than the next person. But then to say, like you were saying, I mean, I don't care what line of beliefs or drive me to the point to where I'm actually pulling the trigger, or the point to where I'm actually doing that. I wouldn't want to make that judgment on anybody of what they're actually going to do unless they've really showed their hand. I mean, geez, there are cases of that. But the everyday person who is in this situation, the everyday soldier, the everyday, I don't know how else to really put it. I think I agree with you in that sense that he's being heavily overgeneralized towards a community of people that he can look at from a statistical perspective. And he could look at from a religious perspective and attempt to take an interpretation of that book and see the logical connectives and then make draw a conclusion. Mm-hmm. But it's really unhelpful because it's under nuanced.
And I think there's a quote that really illustrates that point,
right.
In which it's funny because he says it and because he's talking about Americans, it's kind of different. I'll read it for you. So, now imagine the benighted Americans of 1863 coming to possess chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons. This is more or less the situation we confront in much of the developing world. This quote, right here, right? Okay, I'm imagining that. So I'm supposed to imagine 1863 Americans, right? So what? Civil War Americans,
mm-hmm.
Okay, he's asserting that they would have, unleashed a chemical weapon on all of, I don't know, slaves, I don't know, their enemies.
Right.
To assert that in the vacuum of reason, we don't know what they would have done, right? There's no way to know what they would have done.
You could try to make probability judgments.
Sure,
but
you can make probability judgments, but in this instance, I think that might be almost fruitless. in the sense of trying to
to
apply that to the developing world now.
Yeah, and no, I agree that it's not helpful. It's not a helpful way to communicate the problem, even if they're granting there is a problem. Let's say of a bit of a lag of development in that sort of thought, and remember when we're saying stuff like that, we're making some pretty substantial claims about moral truths and moral rights and wrongs, and it may seem very natural and easy for us, but for, like we say, for many of those people who live in a different culture, who have a different kind of line of belief systems that help inform their morality, it's very different. One point that I wanted to make quickly before we kind of start to wrap this up is getting back to Ben Affleck a little bit. I actually think, and you have to tell me what you think of this, Harris could fall into a bit of a racial category, a racist sort of category. And here's why I say that. And this is kind of more of a philosophical side note in the sense of he definitely leans towards like kind of a reductionist view of the world, right? So, and he's also a determinist in the sense of freedom and the laws of nature and physics are not compatible with each other, according to how Harris views the world. So, that being the case, I actually think that leads him into some sort of weird racist position based on what he's doing, because he defines his why he's not a racist is because he's not talking about any sort of biological discrimination.
Yeah, that stuck out to me too when he said that.
And so when I'm thinking about what he thinks about the world in line with how he defined what he sees racism as, well, I mean, think about it. If reductionism is true, right? I'm quite sure your average run-of-the-mill evolutionary psychologist could concoct a plausible biological reason for Harris, for all the people involved based on selective traits, thinking certain things, making certain choices that they do based on survivability. So at the end of the day, if you reduce things down, you reduce his morality down, you reduce the choices that we're making down. He actually, ironically, seems to basically, under his own definition, be just a racist. I mean, it's not that he can do anything about it.
Right.
His freedom's incompatible with the laws of nature to some degree. So he's basically acting out the way things to some degree would be. And him and Dan Dennett, who was another popular guy, fight about this. But I just found that ironic, and I wondered what you thought about that little thought.
Yeah, I actually made some notes about that part. And, when he said biological, that kind of just cued me into like, oh, that's why he says he's not racist. Like, he thinks that just because he doesn't think there's literally something physically and biologically different about, someone who's born in Iraq, that he's not racist. But, race is, historically and traditionally, it wasn't necessarily always referred to in biological terms, right? Just a great example of that is someone who was in England who is, there's a couple of different notions of what, if they're black or not, right? If they come from Africa, okay, yeah, maybe they're black, right? And I'm not necessarily, an expert in
location,
that, yeah, but those things are deterministic by cultural,
many times arbitrary factors
that aren't necessarily just biological, right? We were both born in America. We're both white males, but there's something very different culturally about how we grew up. That those things can sometimes be encompassed into what someone would call race. So what he's calling biological purely, he's just missing the point. That's not why you're called a racist. It's not because you think it's biological.
Yeah, and maybe just a bit of imprecision with the terminology,
sure,
or him defining what he thinks it is and what it's not, and then maybe there's definitely room for that sort of conversation. So towards the end, Chomsky kind of loses patience. I mean, it becomes clear pretty quickly. I mean, the first response. But something that I thought was interesting with Chomsky, when we talk, just going back quickly to the moral equivalence aspect, it seems like to me, and tell me if you got this from reading Chomsky's response, that he argues with Harris, and he kind of is belligerent towards Harris because Harris brings up the question of, well, do you see these things as morally equivalent? These two, the Clinton thing and the other example that he was giving. And Chomsky, explicitly denies it. No, it's not morally. I didn't call it a horrendous crime. Remember, I didn't call it this. I didn't call it that. They're two different things. But then at the end of the day, Chomsky writes this. This is the apologies for accuracy part. As you know, apologies for the accuracy. He's being very cordial at this point. I described 9/11 as a horrendous crime, quote unquote, committed with, quote, wickedness and awesome cruelty, unquote. In the case of Al-Shifa, which is the pharmaceutical plant case, I said nothing of the sort. I described it as an atrocity, as it clearly is, and merely stated the unquestionable facts. There is no moral equivalence, the term that has been regularly used since Jean Kirkpatrick to try to undercut critical analysis that the state defends. Then he goes on and follows that with this critique of Clinton's perspective and basically saying that Clinton just viewed those individuals that would be affected by the bombing of the Al-Shifa plant as ants. So it sounded like to me, at one side of his mouth, he's saying, of course there's no moral equivalence. The 9/11 is far worse for these reasons. But then out of the other side of his mouth, he also then says, but actually, he agrees with himself.
Right.
There is no moral equivalence. Clinton was worse.
Sure. And
because he thought they were ants.
right.
I mean, wow.
Yeah.
That's a big statement. And obviously, he has. There are plenty of things to look at to say, like you said, extreme negligence. In that case, absolutely. I mean, there's plenty of evidence. The way that they dealt with the UN on the Security Council.
Absolutely. The investigations.
Yeah, the investigations. You could totally point to a number of things and say, there's culpability there for sure. But did he think they were ants? I mean, that's a bit of a slanderous thing to say towards one's view of another human. When, I mean, I don't know. Did you think that was fair? How did you surmise that moral equivalence argument back and forth where Chomsky seems to be talking double?
Fair? Probably not. I think, when Chomsky's talking in these emails, or writing rather, he's almost not talking to Harris, and that's the kind of thing that I get from it.
Yeah, the dual conversation.
Yeah, he's talking to everyone.
Everybody that's piissed him off his entire life on this subject.
It's all being applied to Harris. So when he says that, he's talking, he's talking to George Bush, he's talking to Dick Cheney, he's talking to all these people that have, maybe there is an instance in where, a leader thought it's okay, that's a justifiable loss, right? And I think that's what he's critiquing.
Right.
This justifiable loss for this objective. And that's what he's going after. Maybe to apply it to this instance is probably not a good idea, but I think that's the essence of his argument.
Yeah, I agree. So one thing I wanted to bring up in regard to what Chomsky was saying to Harris and what I viewed as potentially the most difficult thing for Harris to overcome was his distinction that he made between sincere intentions, between sincerity and intentions almost, where he was basically saying, okay, well, somebody can sincerely want the best for whatever they think is the best. So say that they want to create some sort of utopia, and that utopia calls for killing a bunch of innocent people. Their intention is good because they want the utopia, right? But they're going to kill a bunch of innocent people in the process, so that obviously seems something wrong there. But so I think that's a good point. But I think it fails to make a distinction that kind of clears up where the problem may be. And so I kind of wrote down, intentions need to be in league with moral truths or facts. Both of them are important. You take away one, the best intentions could lead to horrible, horrible things, because then you're starting to weigh duties, weigh consequences, all sorts of things are coming into play. But if you so the goal then for let's say ethicists is to try to find what the moral fact is. But then if you take the moral fact and you take that in league with somebody with horrible intentions, well then it's irrelevant what the fact is. So I don't think that you can take away one or you can take away the other. The moral fact of this situation or the moral fact of this right decision is whatever that is, and finding that is extremely important. But then also having intentions to go, goodwill and intentions going along with that. So Hitler, right? Somebody may say, well, yeah, he had the best of intentions, right? But he was wrong about the facts, the moral facts of his dilemmas, of his issues. There were answers to. There were facts. There was something to say. And if somebody wants to question the facts, well, then this conversation goes into just like crazy.
Disarray.
Yeah, it goes into disarray. So, I mean, what do you think about that understanding of getting through Chomsky's, in what my opinion would be the biggest cut on Harris's point?
Right, and I think you're right. That is absolutely the biggest cut on Harris's point, because it shows the limitations of the foundation, really, of the argument that he's making in this email exchange. So, yeah, that's definitely problematic when you take it to the extent that it needs to be taken in order to kind of cover all the bases of the argument.
Mm-hmm. What do you mean by that?
So, when you're talking about, like, when you apply it to Hitler, right? When you apply Harris's argument about moral intentions to Hitler, mm-hmm. right? It becomes clear that we have to think about this in a different way, because, like you said, when you have your moral facts and your goals of intention and pure morality, you could say, almost, or however you want to put it.
If your worldview, let's say, determines a certain goal,
right,
and that goal is good, maybe lots of people would see it as
right,
good.
the utopian goal
right.
compared to the moral facts. When the way that Harris is arguing, from the sense that I get it, he's arguing from a place that almost, it's not that it disregards one or the other, it just doesn't acknowledge the facts, the moral facts aspect of it, or the real human consequences of the logic that he is applying to his theory about this.
Right.
And I think it's like the perfect storm for Chomsky, because when
both of them, really. I mean,
both
it's like,
of them,
it's
absolutely.
like a perfect storm.
It's a meeting, right in the middle.
Like a horrible meeting.
Yeah, because Chomsky, when he thinks of this idea, right, when he thinks of this moral intention, he doesn't think about the plane of abstract logic. He thinks about the people in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Sudan. I mean, I could keep going down and down the list. Same thing in Vietnam, in Latin America, all these years of Japan, all these years of quote unquote American imperialism.
Sure.
That's what he thinks of, and he thinks of the death and the suffering of that. And that,
he sees it like he's looking at the humanity of it, right?
But almost purely, and he thinks that Harris is. But it's not, I don't think he actually thinks that Harris is sitting there apologizing for the government. Maybe in that moment he did, but maybe his best self doesn't.
Right.
Maybe what he thinks is that what Harris is doing is bad because it enables the government to justify the acts that it has done.
Well, it gives, maybe he would say, Chomsky would probably argue, and I heard some other people argue, that Harris gives kind of a neocon view of the world ammunition, because he's a secular liberal. I mean, Harris is as secular as they come, and he's extremely liberal. I mean, he's a liberal guy. Obviously, people would call him conservative on this issue in some regards to his foreign policy, but I think that heavy critique comes like, hey, you're giving ammunition to this view that I despise.
Right. You're giving ammunition to it, and you're giving it not even just ammunition, but you're just giving it a foundation in which it can proselytize its view of the world, which might not be as pure as Harris's is, right? When you hear someone like Paul Wolfowitz or Dick Cheney, when they talk about torture, among other things, you don't get the sense that they're really,
they don't
talking
communicate
about this
their
view.
compassion
Right.
very well.
There's almost
if it's there, I'm not going to make a judgment on Dick Cheney's compassion or not compassion.
I will.
Yeah, you can. I'm not in his head.
Yes, I
understand. He may be a horrible communicator.
Sure.
But I'm a bad communicator.
I'm willing
lots
to
of times
give
too. So
I don't think I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt, because if his compassion was there, I think I would have seen it applied to something ever, and I'm not sure it has been. But these people like Wolfowitz and Cheney, and you can move into modern day, someone like Bobby Jindal or like Ted Cruz, or it doesn't it doesn't come up. The compassion is lost. What he says, what Sam Harris says, even if it's patronizing in a sense to the developing world.
Yeah,
Yeah,
which it definitely would be.
Yeah, it absolutely is. I mean, even there's some instances where he's...
But he almost admits it's patronizing tone. He's like,
right.
He's trying to say like, but how do we talk about
it's like
this
this
if it's the truth?
self-effacing, patronizing tone that he's using.
I mean, he comes with the assumption that
He's
we
like,
are
I'm
more
sorry.
I am more morally developed than you are.
Right.
So how do we talk about this without
how
being
do we
condescending?
get you more morally developed?
Yeah, exactly. That's
and when
he's in a predicament,
right,
a communicating
he's
predicament.
in a communicating predicament, and he's the only one who I've heard articulate the abstract morality of it because in a political sense. I'm not necessarily reading philosophical theories all day, but I do follow politics quite closely. And all the politicians who advocate for similar things to him don't advocate with the compassion, with the acknowledgement
a failing that
right.
they have, for sure.
So that's what Chomsky's looking at. He's looking at him, and maybe suffice it to say, Chomsky could be slightly worried about Harris's argument gaining favor, because
Chomsky's worked his whole life to try to establish the other argument.
All that he's done, and he thought he had his moment. Right. A couple of years ago, when Obama appointed Chuck Hagel to be defense secretary to pull out of the Middle East and everything. Since then, Chuck Hagel's gone. Right. That it was a complete switch. Right. Obama made that switch, and now maybe Chomsky, in that context, is trying to fight back against this at all costs.
Even slight rationality, because it seems to get a little bit wild there at the end. It's odd to me because the guy is so obviously credentialed that nobody could question it. But at the same time, you're like going, why can't we just we'll just talk about this part? And then it was kind of scattered. It was all, and part of that is totally Sam Harris's fault. He admits it. I haven't heard anything from Chomsky because I doubt he finds this of any value beyond. I mean, he laughed at the fact that Harris even wanted to post it. But yeah, it's quite an intriguing interchange between those two that just was a train wreck from moment one to moment end.
Now it's time for a section we call the end of the rope. So how this works is, after a long discussion, sometimes, it's good to maybe talk about some lighter things.
Some lighter subjects. We're not going to cut
moral
equivalence.
We're not going to cut at things anymore. No more cutting.
The hearts will continue to beat.
Yes, they will. So we will kind of share with you something notable we found from the week, and we'll talk about it for a little bit.
Yeah.
So to start, something really important happened this week in a sport that I love.
Which would be?
Soccer.
Okay.
So FIFA, the conglomeration of confederate soccer participating countries, was indicted by the U.S. government this week.
Yeah, they were.
Yeah, they were.
Pretty heavily.
14 members of FIFA's top staff were indicted on charges from bribery, corruption, to graft, to money laundering. I mean,
Now, we were talking about this. We've talked about this a number of times, just when the World Cup was on last year, talking about situations there. But obviously the situation is much worse in Qatar.
Yeah, I mean, Qatar is like Exhibit A why this is a problem, right?
Right.
Because some people might say, a little bit of corruption, it's a sport, whatever, we'll play it in a different place. But what's happening in Qatar right now, for those of you who don't know, Qatar was awarded the 2022 World Cup, and in second place came the United States, which put together a large bid, which poses some questions about, the U.S. government looking into it. It's like, we were shafted, so now we're going to prosecute.
Yeah.
But
we'll go after you.
Oh, yeah, we will. All of them might. Well, there was the quote.
When the time's right.
There was a quote from the IRS official that went something along like, "This is the World Cup of corruption cases, and we have just issued FIFA a red card."
Now there's a headline.
Yeah, that's a headline.
That's the caliber of the headlines.
He's been waiting for how many years to issue that, right?
Yeah.
He's been writing that.
Little League Soccer.
Yeah, Little League Soccer.
He came in, he was like, oh, perfect. Just gotta wait. Just hold on it.
What's happening in Qatar is it's really horrible. So far in the building of the stadiums there. No, first I'm going to say, it's 140 goddamn degrees in Qatar in the summer.
Right.
That's when the World Cup's supposed to be hosted.
Right.
Now, I grew up playing soccer at various levels, from semi-professional in Europe to, little league here. And
I played Little League and middle school.
there you go, middle school. Close to me.
I had a hat trick one time.
There you go.
Don't mess. I got a trophy.
So even playing in Florida is practically unbearable when it's 95 degrees and like 80% humid, but 140 degrees, I mean, we will literally kill every soccer player that plays in there. So, and they're killing people.
Yeah, they're already killing people.
Yeah. So how this works is they get a lot of Indian migrant workers who get visas, but under the terms of those visas, they have to fill contracts. And essentially, the working conditions are so bad that people are just dying, just building it. It's almost like, it reminds me of the Hoover Dam when we built that.
Right.
They're just getting buried under the stadium a lot of the time.
So is it a lot of actual building casualties, or is it they're not getting fed enough? They're not.
Right. So that it's not really clear, right? I'm sure there's lots of building casualties, but that'll happen when it's 140 degrees and you're working for
you pass out
12-hour
maybe,
days, pass out, don't get seen, dehydration, heat stroke. But in any case, it's approximated around 4,000 people are going to die for this stadium to be built. And that's just crazy. Like 6 people died in the building of the stadiums.
I saw a chart a few days ago. I don't know if you sent it to me. It was a chart of the major, building of, let's say, for Olympics, the past like 5 World Cups, and it showed little, those little human graphics of how many casualties there were in the building of each one. And it was like 1, 6, 12, and this one was
just huge.
Taking up the entire page.
It's like 1,000% more.
It's just insane.
So far, it's in 2022 when the World Cup is.
Right. So how long have they even? When did they get the nod?
They got the nod. I believe it was like 2 years ago. They got the nod. So they've started the project of building the stadiums. They have to build infrastructure. I mean, if you don't know, Qatar is a very tiny island in the Middle East. So they have to build infrastructure. They have to build hotels. They have to build. I mean, all this stuff will literally never be used again. So it's absolutely insane. And there's briberies that got Qatar the World Cup. There's a kind of hilariously sad anecdote about FIFA and bribery.
All right, let's hear it.
In the battle for the 2010 World Cup, Morocco and South Africa were going head to head in Africa. South Africa ended up winning that bid. Morocco offered FIFA officials a bribe of $1 million, right? So that's a hefty bribe.
It sounds very
for a non-profit organization.
It sounds very Dr. Evil.
Yes. Yeah. Well, you should see FIFA's boardroom. It looks like freaking the most evil room you could ever sit in.
Wow. Maybe they got their cues.
Yeah. There you go. And we'll link to that. We'll link to a photo of that in the show notes.
Yeah.
But South Africa won because they offered $10 million bribe. So it's not like it's like Qatar just did it. This is like pervasive bribery. Right. I mean, I saw a funny meme of Nike who'd had bribed FIFA to get a sponsorship for the 2010 World Cup. Instead of just do it, just bribe them. It's the new slogan,
I guess.
Anyway, I've rambled on too long about FIFA.
It's an important topic.
It is an important topic because soccer is the best sport in the world, and we're going to leave that topic there. Right. So, what is your end of the rope?
Golf, mate.
Soccer.
Somewhere.
Just go to your end of your rope.
So mine is far less, I guess you could say, important or interesting. But I got the chance to see the newest. I'm a bit of a disaster movie junkie, and trust me, if you're listening out there and you're going, but those movies suck. I know. I'm aware. But at the same time, something about mass buildings and tsunamis and big ships being thrown over. It's just some sort of visual thing that I just love seeing. So, big disaster movie buff. So, The Rock. San Andreas. I'm going in thinking, okay, well, The Rock can carry this, right? So anyway, it's a disaster movie through and through. I mean, from start to finish.
So you're saying it's a disaster or it's a disaster movie?
I think I clarified that in my initial statement about disaster movies. Yeah, it fits right into the category.
All of the above.
Yeah, exactly. So in a sense, I loved it. And in a sense, don't go in with expectations that are super. I mean, you're not going to see Selma, right? It's not.
No. Yeah.
It's not that. It's not something that you're going to be walking away going. You're pondering why this person, thought this way about it, and you're not going to be doing that. You're going to be thinking, Well, that was a really big earthquake. And the visuals at times were extremely good, and the visuals at times were a little bit questionable. I was kind of surprised at that. Like,
Yeah,
right
that's what they have to do. That's what they have to get right.
And I've been surprised about that for a couple of disaster movies now. Like 2012 kind of shocked me. There's a scene, I don't know if you remember, where the car is, like, craziness is happening, and John Cusack is in the limo or whatever's, they're driving out of the city. I think they're in LA. And go back and watch that scene with a critical eye for CG. It is confusingly bad because they have all the money in the world for this. They can make this like the most incredible thing you've ever seen, and yet it's bad. This movie opens up to a scene where you're seeing things move around. It's obviously totally done in by computers, and it's poor. I'm just confused. Now it gets better. Not all the visuals are bad, but anyway, it's a movie that I'd say it's Netflix.
It's Netflix.
I'd put it at Netflix.
I think that's the quote of the day. It's Netflix.
It's Netflix.
That's our show. You can find us on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, and SoundCloud. If you'd like to help us out, please rate our podcast and subscribe. You can follow me on Twitter at @MaxSejo. You can follow Justin at Justin Bailey. For links to today's topics, check the show notes. You can also find us at medium.com/@InquiriusBlog. He's Justin Bailey. I'm Maximilian Sejo. Keep inquiring.